Record. Okay. So, as was advertised, today's class is just an overview of the laws of Yom Tov. When we talk about the laws of Yom Tov, it's very easy for them to get lost in the shuffle. What do I mean? What I mean is that, when we spend a lot of time, especially before Pesach. What's the focus of the classes that the rabbi very often gives before Pesach? It usually is focused on how to, make your kitchen kosher for Pesach. When it comes to sukkahs, for example, we're really, really busy with making a sukkah. We've just come out of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. We haven't been studying the laws of Yom Tov. Yom Kippur is much like Shabbos, and perhaps Rosh Hashanah and Shavuos are the best times to be discussing the laws of Yom Tov. Rosh Hashanah perhaps would be excluded from that because you spend a lot of time, talking about repentance and mending your ways, and that becomes the focus of the season. So I guess Shavuos would be the last Yom Tov standing that it makes sense to have some discussions and start learning about the laws of Yom Tov, especially as there are a lot of misnomers. There's a lot of misinformation about what we're allowed to do, what we're not allowed to do on Yom Tov. And it's always a good idea to refresh and review some of these points of Jewish practice. This class was actually recommended or requested by my wife, Hannah, who had a conversation with one or two ladies in the community who requested such a class, such a refresher course. And so hence here we are. We're going to be studying the laws of Yom Tov, and we're really going to be focused on the laws that are different on Yom Tov versus Shabbos. Now, why does Shabbos enter into the equation? Why is the Sabbath something that comes up? Why is it that we have to always compare and contrast Yom Tov and Shabbos? And the answer is very, very simple. When we talk on Shabbos, when we talk about the obligation to rest, we define the rest that we're meant to perform, the rest that we're most meant to take advantage of, the rest that we partake in on Shabbos in the context of 39 labors that are forbidden. There are 39 creative labors that were utilized in the construction of the Mishkan, in the tabernacle, in the portable sanctuary used in the desert. And those 39 forms of creative labor are the metric for rest. We're not allowed to perform those kinds of labors on Shabbos. And by extrapolation, also, we're not allowed to conduct those same labors on Yom Tov. The obligation to rest on Yom Tov is largely drawn from Shabbos. It's drawn from the Sabbath. And we see this linguistically within the Torah itself, within the Hebrew anyways, because many Yomim Tovim, many holidays are referred to as a Shabbos, as a day of rest or days of rest, in excess to the seventh day of rest. So linguistically, we see that they're connected, and we know that there's an obligation to rest on Yom Tov. Therefore, we assume that the same labors that we're not allowed to perform on Shabbos, we don't do on Yom Tov. So what are the kinds of labors that we don't do on Shabbos? Well, just about most things that you're familiar with when it comes to Shabbos, like cuttings, like sewing, like planting, like sewing, sewing with a needle and thread, and sewing by putting seeds into the ground. In general, we say those same things are prohibited on Yom Tov. However, there is one exception to this. There is one class of labor that we say is permitted on Yom Tov. And it's based on this verse. It's based on this pasuk. It comes to us from the book of Exodus. It comes to us from the book of Shmos. This is chapter 12, verse 16, Yud Beis Tes Zayin. Let me read the verse for you. Let me read the pasuk. Ach asher ye'ochel l'chol nefesh hu levado ye'osel lochem. Only that which you eat on Yom Tov, those things you may do. What the pasuk here is saying is that there's an obligation to rest. However, we are permitted to partake in a class of labor that is called ochel nefesh, things that people need to eat. People need to live, essentially. That's why the word nefesh comes into this discussion here. So on Yom Tov, we're allowed to perform labors that would otherwise be forbidden on Shabbos if they're specific for the production of food. And in this class, we're going to clarify what exactly does this entail. What is included in ochel nefesh? It's very easy for us to perhaps use our own natural gift and draw an inference to say, well, if I'm allowed to perform labors that are necessary for food, maybe I should be allowed to go to work because I'm earning money in order to buy the food that I'm going to be consuming, I'm going to be eating. Maybe I should be allowed to plow my field. Maybe I should be allowed to hunt animals. Maybe I should be allowed to fish. Um, you know, most things could be argued as a necessity in order to accrue and provide food. So we're going to clarify what are the kinds of things that we're allowed to do on Yom Tov that we're not allowed to do on Shabbos, and we're going to draw some restrictions, restricted to this, to where specifically they're permitted, and clarify what we're not allowed to do. There is also another sort of knock-on class of labor that we say one is allowed to perform, and it's based on a rule that's called in Hebrew mitoch. Mitoch is the Hebrew word for since or because. And the rationale works like this. Since I'm allowed to perform labor X for the production of food or for the preparation of food, I should then therefore be allowed to perform this labor or participate in this labor for something that is not for the production of food. So essentially what we're saying is that there's a class of labor on Shabbos, there's a class of melacha that we're allowed to do on Yom Tov that's not food related, but because for food related purposes, we've been given an exemption, we apply that exemption to these labors as well. And that's a rule called mitoch that says that if I'm allowed to do it for the food production, I'm allowed to do it for things that are not necessarily food. When we say that you're allowed to prepare food on Yom Tov, does that mean I'm allowed to do the following? You know what? I always find that it's so stressful for me to prepare for holidays. It's really, really difficult for me to get all the menus down and to make all the preparations. But I'm allowed to cook on Yom Tov. So maybe, you know what? I'm just not going to do any prep before Yom Tov. And once Yom Tov comes around, I'll just, I'll make the meals on the day themselves. Am I allowed to do that? Is that something that should also be permitted? And in general, what we're going to say, and we're going to show, is that while it's true we are allowed to do a lot of things on Yom Tov, there are restrictions. And one of the most notable restrictions, and it's going to be the first restriction I'm going to speak to, is the concept of Simchas Yom Tov, or Simchat Yom Tov. The idea that the Chazal, the rabbis, wanted Yom Tov to be used for the purpose of the Yom Tov, which was to enjoy yourself, to relax. And as such, there are many rabbinic injunctions against forms of labor that would be considered hard labor or toil. Even if they're permitted on Yom Tov, we generally restrict based on this idea of preserving the enjoyment of the day itself. I mean, a person could also argue, maybe, you know what, if I'm not going to work if I'm not going to work on Sukkot, and I have 2 days off, maybe I should be baking bread, I should be baking challah for the entire year. I have all day to do it. The Chazal do not want you to partake in Yom Tov in this manner, and therefore there are certain restrictions. So let's start. We're going to clarify all of these points. So let's discuss how we classify ochel nefesh. We say that ochel nefesh is a class of labor, a class of preparation that you're allowed to partake in. What does that include? The Gemara, it is, I believe, in Moed Katan, spends a lot of time discussing this. And the halacha conclusion, anyways, the conclusion that matters for us, is that ochel nefesh is anything that a person needs, even if it's not necessarily for the production of food, but it's something that is considered a bodily need, and it's considered to be a daily necessity. And as such, we say, I'm allowed to boil water, for example. I'm allowed to boil water to make soup, to boil potatoes, to boil eggs. I'm also allowed to heat water up to wash my face. Ochel nefesh does not only mean preparing food, it also means enabling me to take care of bodily needs that are considered to be daily needs. The example, as I mentioned a moment ago, is washing their hands, washing their face. If they want to warm up something, they're allowed to, to kindle a fire. We'll talk about where fire is permitted, but I'm allowed to, for example, have a fire if I'm carrying a flame and light a fire in my fireplace to warm myself up. I'm allowed to do that as well. That's considered to be a daily need, and it's considered to be a bodily need. That's also included in the broad category of ochel nefesh, a class of labors that we're allowed to perform on Yom Tov. I'm allowed to, for example, light candles. I'm allowed to light candles. If, for example, I need the light, I want to be able to read, I want to see where I'm going, I want to make sure I don't step on my kid's Lego. I'm allowed to kindle fires. That's considered also to be a bodily need. And as such, we'll talk about how it's permitted, but I'm allowed to, carry a flame, take one candle and light another candle, and that's considered to be a bodily need that is a daily need and would therefore be permitted. A big question comes up about, okay, also lighting. There's also, we don't do this in Calgary, but it's done in many congregations. There's a candle lit on the podium. There's a candle lit on the where the chazan, where the leader, where the shliach tzibur leads prayers. We don't have a separate one. We just use the bima. We just use our shulchan where we read the Torah, the same location where we lead services. But in many congregations, there's usually a shtender by the front of the shul where the person who leads services stand there. And there's a long-standing custom to have a candle or a light there, and it's a way of showing honor to the holy place that is the synagogue. Lighting those kinds of candles are acceptable as well, because that's considered to be a daily need, where we're showing respect is considered to be a form of respect for the synagogue, to the congregation. Yahrzeit candles are a question. Can I light a yahrzeit candle on Yom Tov? It's not a bodily need. It's not something that anyone needs, right? You don't generally use the yahrzeit candle to you don't light a yahrzeit candle in order to read a book. You don't use the yahrzeit candle, at least yahrzeit candles that are lit for somebody, if somebody has a bereavement. People don't, you're not using the yahrzeit candle to be a source of flame to light other things. You just have a yahrzeit candle to remember somebody who's passed away. It's a big question amongst halachic authorities. So the way around this question is taking the yahrzeit candle and reading to its light for a moment or two. So if somebody has a yahrzeit on a day of Yom Tov, they forgot to light the night before, or if it's on the second day of Yom Tov, they could light the yahrzeit candle and just use it for one of these bodily needs that we mentioned, that now will allow that flame, the kindling of that candle, to be considered within the class of ochel nefesh, something that is considered to be a legitimate bodily need or a daily need. Now, in extrapolation of this, we also say in general, what constitutes ochel nefesh is something that is done regularly and on a daily basis, something that someone would do any day of the year. So, for example, any day of the year, I would be boiling potatoes. Any day of the year, I would be washing my face. Any day of the year, I would be I guess that would not be a good example. I would be sorting cutlery, things like that. So in all these cases, we say that since these are done on a daily basis and they're done regularly and they're done not according to a specific season, these are permitted to be done on Yom Tov as well. That does not
taking the garbage out.
We'll get to garbage soon. We'll get to garbage hopefully soon. We'll be talking about garbage. But taking the garbage out is considered to be a bodily need. It's considered to be a regular daily need. It's something that you would do any day as long as garbage is being picked up. We'll talk about that soon, though. Okay. But for example, plowing a field, that's not something that's done on a daily basis. Threshing your grain, that's only done at certain times during the year. Planting seeds in a garden is only done at certain times of the year as well. So when we talk about ochel nefesh, we talk about a class of labor, kitchen activities that are specific and are performed regularly and daily. Things that are done seasonally are not considered to be a form of ochel nefesh. So that would limit what we're allowed to do in the kitchen. It limits certain things, but it does allow for others. We'll talk about what are some of those examples soon. Let's talk now about mitoch. I mentioned to you a moment ago, we also said that if something is permitted on Yom Tov, we say that not only will it be permitted for ochel nefesh, it will be permitted for other things as well that are perhaps not so much ochel nefesh, not necessarily things that you would eat. Where does this come up? This comes up specifically. It comes up specifically. Let me just move this so you don't get the sun over there. This comes up specifically with regards to carrying on Yom Tov. Carrying, it's very difficult for one to say, is a form of food preparation. However, if I were invited to Herb's house for a Shabbos lunch, or if I were going over to Mel's house to have a cup of tea, I'm allowed to bring over some cake for us to enjoy, or I'm allowed to bring over dessert to eat with Herb. I'm allowed to be bringing these things over in order to consume, in order to eat food. So if I'm allowed to carry for food production, there is also an expansion that says even for non-food related items, I would be permitted to carry as well. So for example, let's imagine that Chabad, I'm trying to get the sun out of the camera. Doesn't matter. No, I don't think anybody's suffering from it anyways. For example, let's say Chabad, their Sefer Torah was found to be invalid. And they run over to the house of Jacob one Yom Tov morning and say, we need a Sefer Torah. Can you lend us one of yours? And we say, sure, we love you, Rabbi Matislav. We want to help you. We want to ensure that your congregation is able to read from the Torah as well. And we hand off a Sefer Torah to Rabbi Matislav to carry all the way over to the Chabad house. That would be permitted, even though the reading from the Sefer Torah is not something that it would be considered food preparation in any way. But since we're allowed to carry for food-related purposes, we're also allowed to carry for non-food related purposes. Another example, I'm at home and I realize I did not take my special recently dry cleaned talis to the to shul Erev Yom Tov. I'm allowed to take that talis with me to shul because I'm going to be using that talis that day. And that's another condition. It has to be specifically for that day's needs. It can't be in preparation for the next day. But if I'm going to be bringing a talis to shul for that morning, that would be okay. Another example, I want to bring Junior with me to shul. I want to bring the baby. I want to bring Avram Chaim. And Avram Chaim is a petulant 3-year-old who decides he doesn't want to walk to shul one morning. I am allowed to pick him up and carry him. I'm allowed to put him into a stroller. I'm allowed to bring him to shul. Why am I allowed to do this? Well, because it's a nachas for me. I'm able, being able to spend time with my kid. That's considered to be a need of the day. It's considered to be something that I'm going to enjoy. I'm allowed to bring him for the enjoyment that brings me, for the purpose that I'm allowed to carry for a purpose. As it doesn't have to be food related, but as long as it is specific to a need that I will have on that day, then it is allowed. Then I am allowed to take that to take it with me. It has to be a legitimate Yom Tov need. So, for example, I would not be allowed to carry my car keys to shul, for example. I might like the way they sound. They might give me some kind of I guess I like feeling the weight. It provides a little bit more exercise, whatever the case may be. That's not considered to be a legitimate need for the day. It has to be a pretty standard need that we could say would be common to all people. That actually has ramifications for medications and things like that. Aspirin and Advil, those are the sorts of things that anyone would be prescribed for a headache. Most antibiotics also are likewise. If somebody's taking a very specialized medication, it's not necessarily a medication that everyone would be prescribed. Therefore, that sort of medicine would perhaps not be allowed to be brought to shul if you're going to need it that morning. Perhaps it would be advisable if you bring it beforehand. But if I have a need for that day, I'm allowed to carry, even if it's not food related, as long as A, it's considered to be a legitimate Yom Tov need, and B, it's considered to be a need that is common to all people. So those are the two conditions. We say, since I'm allowed to prepare food, I'm allowed to carry food, I'm also allowed to carry other items as long as it meets these criteria. Again, the criteria is that it has to be a legitimate Yom Tov need, and it has to be common to all people. And it has to be for that day specifically. All right, now, I've already spoken a little bit to this. One common issue that arises on Yom Tov is hachana, which is preparation. Even activities that are permitted on Yom Tov, such as tidying a room, setting a table, and other things as well, like we've just discussed, carrying, and even ochel nefesh labors, like preparing food, I'm only allowed to do them on Yom Tov for that day itself. It has to be for that day. I'm not allowed on Yom Tov to prepare for after Yom Tov or for the next day of Yom Tov. We said that that is a prohibition. One cannot do from one day to the next. So, for example, let's imagine that I have my shtender at home and I say, you know what, I really like using the shtender. I would like to use the shtender at shul. I'm allowed to bring it with me Shabbos morning, but I'm only allowed to bring it back home if I'm going to be using it that day at home. What's that? Yes, Yom Tov morning, excuse me. I'm only allowed to bring it home if I'm going to be using it that day. I cannot be bringing it for the next day. So that would mean also if I were to be bringing it after Mincha, bringing it to Shul for Ma'ariv, I would not be allowed to do that because Ma'ariv would be considered something for the next day. Setting a table after lunch on Yom Tov afternoon for that night would likewise be prohibited because you're now doing a preparation, you're performing a hachana, you are now preparing something from day 1 to day 2. Cooking for that day, if I'm going to be cooking today, if I'm going to be boiling eggs, I cannot be boiling eggs for the evening. I'm only allowed to boil eggs for the eggs that I will eat that day. An interesting question comes up with regards to a lulav. Let's imagine that I have a lulav. I've taken it to shul with me in the morning. Am I allowed to bring it home? I've met my obligation. I was yotze with it. Am I allowed to bring it home with me? There is a rationale that says, well, if it's at shul with all the kids who run around and with people who have sticky fingers, it might disappear, it might get broken, it might be destroyed, I may not be able to use it the next day. Well, that's considered to be a legitimate need for that day because I want my lulav to be whole. That's a need for today. That provides a certain amount of emotional well-being for me. So that means I have to bring it to a place that's safe. So let's say I'm bringing my lulav home and I'm going to be eating at the Rogolski's house for Shabbos for Yom Tov lunch. Am I allowed to bring it now to my house? And the answer is probably not. I mean, there are ways we can finagle it, but generally speaking, if the reason why I'm bringing my lulav home is to keep it safe, it's safe at the Rogolski's. The place where it's unsafe is at shul. Okay, you're saying maybe, but well, I'll leave it with Elena and it'll be safe. If it's in a safe place and the only reason why I'm carrying it is to keep it safe, then when it's at my friend's house, it's at my friend's house. It's safe. I have no more reason to be bringing it to my house. If my wife has yet to fulfill the mitzvah, yeah, I can bring it home for her to make use of, and maybe that's the justification. But if it's only to keep it safe, then I would not be able to bring it back to my house after having eaten lunch with someone else. All right. Now, we said that hachana, doing something from day 1 to day 2 is prohibited. We do have some loopholes. There are ways in which I'm allowed to cook on day 1 for day 2, and this is through a rule that we call riboy shiurim, which is increased measures. If I'm allowed to perform label X for the purposes of ochel nefesh, we allow me to add more to the pot than the minimum of what I'm going to need. So let's say, for example, I want to boil water because I want some tea, and I only need about 500 mils of water to make the cup of tea. But I also know that I'm going to need hot water for that night. I'm allowed to boil the water on Yom Tov, and I can put that pot on even with the full 2.5 liters, significantly more than what I'm going to need. However, there are conditions here as well. There are 3 conditions that have to be met. The first condition is that I can't be doing, it has to all be in the same utensil. So for example, if I have this big pot, if I'm putting the pot on the oven, it's all together in that same pot. It's not like I'm putting more things on the oven and then putting more things on the oven and then putting more things on the oven or on the stove. I'm putting it all in one pot, and that pot is being placed on the stove. As long as it's all in the same utensil, that is considered to be a condition number 1. Condition number 2 is that there cannot be any extra labor. What do I mean? Let's imagine that I have blintzes frying in a pan. And for every single one of these blintzes, I'm going to have to take a spatula and turn over. even though it's all in the same pot, each one is being treated individually. I have to interact. I have to do some kind of interaction with each piece individually. Since that is the case, I would not be permitted to do it. So as long as it's all in the same pot and I don't have to do any more work than just putting it on the stove, that would be acceptable. If I have to do more things like breading chicken cutlets or stuffing cabbage or stuffing kreplach, where I'm playing around with individual items and I'm doing more work than just simply adding more, then that's not allowed. And finally, I cannot specify, I cannot say explicitly, I'm boiling more water for the next day's meal. So I'm allowed to do this prep on Yom Tov afternoon for the second day of Yom Tov, for that night, as long as I've met these three conditions. That is all in the same utensil. I'm not doing any more work than I would be otherwise. And finally, I'm not stating explicitly that it's for the next night. If I meet all three of these conditions, then I'm allowed to cook on Yom Tov afternoon and have the food ready for that night's Suda. Yes.
Necessary to actually partake of it on that first day?
Well, you have to be making the claim that I'm boiling it for now. So yes, you would have to enjoy. You do have to be. Again, there has to be like a base, something that you're making for today. So yes, that is correct. You would have to consume some of it. But that's, I started off with saying, I want a cup of tea now. I'm allowed to add more water in the pot and put that whole pot on the stove. The assumption was, yes, you are going to be having that cup of tea that day. We also say, and actually it's actually interesting, when we allow something, sometimes we're forced into a much greater deal of work. So the example that comes up all the time, I'm allowed to shecht on Yom Tov. Well, not that I would ever shecht, but a person is allowed to shecht on Yom Tov. Even if you only want a single steak, even if you only want a single hamburger, even if you only want a single chunk of beef, you can't get the meat without slaughtering the entire animal. We allow that. Similarly, also, we say that a whole chicken, if I can't get this one piece of chicken without roasting the entire chicken, I'm allowed to roast the entire chicken in order to get that one piece that I want. And that's kind of this rule of riboy b'shiurim, where you're adding to the work and you're not doing anything extra, anything more than you otherwise would. That will allow for the larger amount of food to be prepared and enjoyed that next day. So let's talk about the very specific malachos that we're allowed to do on Yom Tov. The first one is bishul, cooking. On Shabbos, I'm not allowed to cook. I'm not allowed to boil water. I'm not allowed to put something in an oven. On Yom Tov, I am allowed to do these things. However, there is something of a caveat, as I mentioned earlier. Chazal wanted people to enjoy Yom Tov. And so generally we say that something that could have been done before Yom Tov should have been done before Yom Tov, and you should limit the sorts of things that you do on Yom Tov to things that could not have been done before Yom Tov. What's an example of something that could not have been done before Yom Tov? Well, making a salad. In many cases, you're cutting up vegetables, the vegetables start to wilt. If you're going to open the bag of salad, I guess that would be our equivalent. That's not a good example. But if I'm going to be sort of chopping up small vegetables, I can't do that in advance because otherwise, it's likely that the stuff is going to spoil. Things are going to go bad. The coleslaw is going to get soggy. I happen to like soggy coleslaw, but other people I know don't. All these things you cannot really do certain kinds of food prep before Yom Tov. So therefore, you're allowed to do them on Yom Tov. So when it comes to cooking, it's much the same. There are a class of no, you don't swap mosquitoes on Yom Tov. There are certain kinds of foods which have to be done in advance. And we say they must be done in advance because they actually taste best done in advance. And so therefore, for all intents and purposes, they should have been done. Like, compote, for example, tastes better after it's been chilled and after it's been in the refrigerator for a couple of days. It's one of those things the rabbis say, for those sorts of things, you cannot do it on Yom Tov because it should have been done beforehand and it's better to have been done beforehand. But things that are in that area that, yeah, they could have been done beforehand, and they probably would not have suffered in any way, that we say, yeah, you can do them before Yom Tov. You can do those things on Yom Tov as well. We also say, for example, let's imagine for a moment that I'm having 12 guests coming to my house for a Shabbos meal, for a Yom Tov meal. And so what do I do? Does that mean I have to measure out explicitly, specifically 12 portions of food and to put into the oven or to put into the stove, 12 pieces of chicken? The answer is no, I don't. I do not have to do that. I want if I don't have to be very, very exact, as long as I'm putting out in proportion to the number of people who are going to be here, that's 100% okay. That is fine. I'm allowed to, as we said, we spoke about, riboy b'shiurim, you're allowed to add more, even in cases where you're not allowed to add more in some of those cases, in some of those circumstances. I'm allowed to do more. For example, I can bread more chicken cutlets than the 12 people who are coming, because, sometimes people want to have an additional chicken cutlet. Sometimes guests won't take food if they think that there isn't enough to go around. And if you only have 12 pieces of chicken, perhaps people aren't going to enjoy themselves. They're not going to eat. They're not going to eat. They're not going to eat as much as they were as much as they otherwise would want to. Sometimes, in cases like sometimes chicken tastes better when you're baking many pieces of chicken together versus just a single one. So for all these reasons, we say that you have a lot of slack, you have a lot of latitude. You don't have to cook specifically for the number of people that you're having. You can cook, within reason, even in excess of the number of people that you're going to have. This is true even, for example, where I have a very large pan, but I only need one small piece of potato kugel. And if I only make the piece of kugel in this very large pan, it's going to spread out and it's going to burn. It's not going to come out right. So if I only need that one piece of kugel, and I can't make that one piece of kugel without making an entire tray full of kugel, I'm allowed to make an entire tray full of kugel. And that includes things like washing the individual potatoes. That includes peeling the individual potatoes. All these things I'm allowed to do, even though I only need a small little piece of kugel. If I can't get that small little piece of kugel without making an entire pan, I'm allowed to do that. And I can throw that entire pan into the oven. So this is bishul, where I'm cooking, baking, where you're making something edible through the exposure to heat. What did we say are the conditions? We said the conditions here is that it should be for that day. It should be I should only do on Yom Tov what I could not do before Yom Tov. If at all possible, you should do it beforehand. Otherwise, I'm impugning the Simchas Yom Tov that Chazal prioritize. And I'm allowed to cook even in excess of my needs, even things that I would not have otherwise been allowed to do. Like we said before, I'm allowed to add more to the pot, but I'm not allowed to bread additional chicken breasts. I'm allowed to do that. I'm allowed to do that on Yom Tov, even in excess of the number of people who are going to be here, because again, for all those aforementioned reasons, sometimes it tastes better if there's more stuff. Sometimes it's guests feel more comfortable if there's more food. It adds to the ambiance to have, an abundance of stuff on the table. There is this consideration. So cooking is one of those permitted activities on Yom Tov. All right. Now, the next thing we're going to be discussing about is ma'avir, which is kindling a fire. Now, it's true that ochel nefesh allows me to do just many things that are necessary for the production or preparation of food. That's only so if it is something that could not have been done the day before, as we've said. If there's something that could have been done the day before, you do it the day before. And sometimes we have a hard stop saying the only time you can do this is the day before. And one such example is lighting a fire. On Yom Tov, you're not allowed to kindle a new flame. You can't strike a match. You can't flip on a light switch, which is considered to be a form of fire, at least with with incandescent light bulbs, the ones that have metal that turn red hot. It's a little bit more questionable, fluorescent and LEDs. We'll talk about that another time. But I'm not allowed to kindle a new flame, but I am allowed to carry a pre-existing flame. So lighting candles, for example, with a match would be forbidden. But if I have a candle that was already lit, I can light my candles from that pre-existing flame. So we spoke about food preparation. I'm allowed to make food on Yom Tov, and kindling a fire is considered to be part of food preparation, and that we are much more expansive about that. We say you're allowed to kindle a fire for any bodily need. You cannot kindle a new fire. You can only carry from an existing flame. And this is a rabbinic prohibition. What would be some examples? Gas stoves. Gas stoves. If you have one of those old-fashioned gas stoves that have a pilot light, on Yom Tov, you'd be allowed to turn on the gas, and the natural pilot light will light the gas as it comes out, and you will have the ability to cook on that flame because you have not kindled a new fire. That said, if you have an electric starter, that would be a no-go because you're now kindling a new flame. We also said, as I mentioned a moment ago, red hot pieces of metal is considered an existing flame. And as such, let's imagine that you have an electric stove and you have your elements on. You can take a match and hold it to the hot element and then light your candles from that, because the element is considered to be a pre-existing flame. Even if it's not red hot per se, since it is hot metal, it's considered to be a form of fire. And as such, you can catch a flame from that and light candles. I remember as a kid, my father going downstairs to the furnace and lighting candles from the pilot light in our gas furnace downstairs. And that'll probably be something of a past as we transition to heat pumps and other forms and other alternative forms of heat. You can, let's say I'm sitting in a room and I'm awfully cold and there's a fire in the firing place. I'm allowed to add wood because that's considered a bodily need. It's a need for the day. It's a need that everybody has. And I'm not kindling a new flame. I am just utilizing a pre-existing flame. Now on Yom Tov, we're a lot more lenient than we are on Shabbos. And let's say, for example, I don't have a light in my room. I don't have a light in my room and I want to read, or I don't have a light in my room and my kid is afraid of the dark. I don't have a light in my room and I have to change a diaper. I have to get dressed or something of that sort. I am allowed to go over to my next door neighbor and ask them to turn on the lights for me or light a match for me for lighting candles. Excuse me, so on and so forth. We're much more lenient when it comes to asking non-Jews to do things for us. In general, we say something I'm not allowed to do. I'm not allowed to ask a non-Jew to do unless there is a certain list of conditions that are met. Those conditions are not as present on Yom Tov, and asking your non-Jewish neighbor or roommate or whoever it may be is considered much more of an option on Yom Tov than on Shabbos. Now, that's about kindling fire. What about extinguishing a fire? Lowering or extinguishing a fire is forbidden. I'm only allowed to do things that are necessary for food preparation. Things that are not necessary for food preparation, can't do. So that means I cannot extinguish a flame. So that means I can't put out a candle. If I have a match that's burning, I can only put it down. I can't extinguish it. Moshe Feinstein, however, says that if you can translate the extinguishing of the flame into a food need, then it would be permitted. And the example that's given is if I have a very high flame and my soup is going to scald, it's going to scorch on the bottom, I'm allowed to lower the temperature to prevent that from happening, because now I've translated the extinguishing of the flame into a food-related need. But in the absence of that, it's not considered to be in the absence of this, one is not allowed to extinguish a fire. So let's imagine for a moment that I have a gas stove and I have a flame that's high and I'm worried about safety. I'm worried about the financial loss. I'm worried about the excess heat. What can I do? Well, if I can boil a pot of water, I can fill it up all the way to the top. And I'm going to say, I want to have some teas. I'm allowed to add to the pot more than I would otherwise need. And I'm allowed to allow the pot to flow over the sides and extinguishing the fire. And then I can just turn off the gas. That is one way to do that. You obviously cannot do that with an electric stove, but you can do that with a gas stove. When it comes to an electric stove, what options do we have? The option is we can ask a non-Jew to do it for us. And we have much more leniency, much more license to do so. Likewise, also, if I have a light on in my room and I'm not going to sleep with that light on, that's now a bodily need, I'm allowed to ask a non-Jew to turn off that light for me. I'm not allowed to do it myself, but the non-Jew can. All right. Now, borer is another task we're allowed to do on Yom Tov that we're not allowed to do on Shabbos. On Shabbos, we do have some conditions. The example given, for sorting, I'm allowed to take good from the bad if it's for immediate consumption. So that means if I have I have some grapes in front of me and I have bad grapes and good grapes, I'm allowed to pick the good grapes and pop them in my mouth. I'm doing it by hand, picking up the stuff that I want to eat, and I'm using it for immediate consumption. Any other sorting on Shabbos is verboten. It's forbidden. You're not allowed to do it. So I can't, for example, sort cutlery. I can't take out all the forks of a pile and put them into a drawer. You have to, there are other ways of doing it, but I can't sort of sort in that manner on Shabbos. On Yom Tov, however, we actually have much greater license. It is completely permitted if you have the following conditions. A, it's part of your daily food prep. It's something that you would normally do. It's a regular kitchen behavior. It's not like sorting out bad kernels of grain from good kernels of grain, which is not something a person does normally. We're talking about regular food preparation, choosing good beans from bad beans, good grapes from bad grapes. B, the sorting that we're doing now could not have been done before Yom Tov. For example, like peeling vegetables, removing the skins. We say you're allowed, then as long as you have those conditions, then you're allowed to sort. You're allowed to, you don't have to worry. You don't have that Shabbos condition, where the Shabbos says you can only take the good stuff and the bad stuff. Here, you can even remove the bad stuff as long as there's more good stuff than bad stuff. We generally say that when it comes to sorting food on Yom Tov, we're much more lenient. And we also say that it can be used with a utensil. So, for example, filtering coffee would be permitted. You can use a coffee filter on Yom Tov. You can't use it on Shabbos. Again, because it's part of your daily food preparations. And coffee made the day before is never as nice as coffee made that very morning. Sometimes, however, we say that if the sorting could have been done before Yom Tov, then we do not allow it to be done on Yom Tov unless you do it with some kind of a deviation from the normal way of doing it. So what would be example of the sorting, that could have been done before Yom Tov? Sorting cutlery, sorting forks, knives, spoons, those sorts of things. That's something that could have been done before Yom Tov. It's not going to go bad if you do it before Yom Tov. So since it could have been done before Yom Tov, we therefore, if you have a pile of cutlery, instead of sorting it, you're just taking out all the forks and putting them down into one pile, taking out all the spoons and putting them into one pile. You just take them out one at a time and you put it down and you sort of put it in that order. So you take out a fork, you put it the fork, then you sort of blindly take out another, you take out a knife and you put that with the knives. Instead of sorting each one as you normally would, taking out all the forks first and all the spoons, in this case, since it could have been done before Yom Tov, you do it with a little bit of a change from your standard, from the standard, and it would be acceptable. And again, we say that it would be permitted if you could not have done it before Yom Tov, but since this could have been done before Yom Tov, we said it has to be done in an abnormal manner. Finally, we said there's another border which is never allowed, which is industrial sifting. Taking doing things on scale. If it's just like a colander and you're just sort of, you're spilling out the water from the noodles, that's fine. That's considered that's part of your daily food prep. It could generally it could not have been done before Yom Tov. It's done on a small scale. That would be permitted, but if you're going to be sifting large amounts of flour, then that would not be acceptable. So let's talk about some very specific examples of the sorts of sorting that you're allowed to do on Yom Tov. One is, peeling, using a vegetable peeler and peeling off the skin of a cucumber. That's not something that you would be allowed to do on Shabbos because that's considered to be a form of sorting. But on Yom Tov, you would be allowed to do that. Using an apple coring device. Using a perforated spoon if you're serving out a cholent. On Shabbos, on Shabbos, you wouldn't be allowed to do this, but on Yom Tov, you would. A perforated spoon is considered acceptable. Straining soup with full lid would also be okay. Colander with noodles, we mentioned. Some people will, they'll refrain from using tea bags on Shabbos. On Yom Tov, you are allowed to use tea bags. As I mentioned, you're allowed to use coffee filters. You can juice oranges. You can remove bones from fish. And you can remove bones from chicken, even if it's not for immediate consumption. We said on Shabbos, that's our condition. On Yom Tov, immediate consumption is not a condition. For example, I get really, really annoyed by how all the sidurim and the chumashim have been left out, I'm allowed to sort them and put them away for use later that day. I can sort them in that manner. I'm allowed to wash potatoes, scrubbing off all the schmutz, things I would not be allowed to do on Shabbos. That would be borer. But on Yom Tov, I am allowed to do all of these things, as long as it's for that day, and as long as it's considered to be something that a person would do any day. All right, now, getting back to carrying, I did mention this earlier. We said carrying is permitted based on the principle of mitoch, because once labor A is permitted for food-related purposes, I'm allowed to do it for other purposes as well. Carrying is an example. Since I'm allowed to carry to bring food to somebody's home, I'm allowed to carry other items for even if they're not food, as long as we can say that it was for the purpose, for the use of that day. And what are some examples of this? I bringing my machzor to shul on Rosh Hashanah morning, bringing my talis, bringing my kids in a carriage, where I'm pushing in the carriage. It meets a Yom Tov need, a need for the day to have my kids with me. I enjoy having my children with me. Bringing a lulav home after davening for people to use. Keys are a big one. If I were to leave my door unlocked, or if I were to hide a key by my door, I would be very stressed out. I would be worried that someone might break into my home. Keys provide a bit of menucha. They put my mind to rest. So I'm allowed to carry the key because it provides peace of mind. That becomes a Yom Tov need. And it's actually very important to remember this. If we cannot verify that there is a Yom Tov need in carrying this item, I wouldn't be allowed to carry it. Carrying car keys was the example. Watches, carrying a watch, wearing a watch. Some people don't wear watches on Shabbos if you don't have an Eruv. I personally do wear watches, but I know many people don't. There is a line of ration. There's a big discussion amongst halachic authorities. Is one allowed to wear a watch? Is it considered carrying it? Are you wearing it? It's a big discussion. Knowing the time is a Yom Tov need. You have to know what time you're going to be going. You need to be at shul. You need to know what time it is to pick up your kids. Knowing the time is a Yom Tov need. Therefore, even for people who don't wear watches without an Eruv on Yom Tov, they would wear one because there is a legitimate need on Yom Tov to know the time. But if I'm not allowed to carry for use the next day. So for example, if I'm bringing my talis home after davening and the next day I'm going to be going to a different shul, not a luxury we really have here, but I would not be allowed to do that. I would not be allowed to bring the talis home for use the next day at a different shul. I would not be allowed, for example, to bring my Haggadah home after the first Seder to use in somebody else's home the second Seder. Right? Because that would have me carrying on the first day for use the second day. Let's talk about taking out the trash. Removing garbage from your kitchen, where people normally have their garbage, is a Yom Tov need. Nobody wants overflowing garbage in their vicinity. That's gross, that's yucky, nobody wants it. So I am allowed to take the bag and remove it from that vicinity. But there really isn't a requirement that I take it anywhere. I could take it outside. I can move it to my garage. I can move it to the basement. I can move it anywhere. If I move it out of the vicinity of the kitchen where it's no longer causing me problems, I'm no longer allowed to carry the garbage. I mean, I can't carry it outside. If it's, unless it meets some kind of Yom Tov purpose, there's no permission to carry. And if it's not bothering me because it's not in the kitchen, I can't carry it out. If I can't, if I take it outside, I really can't. Once I put it down outside, I really can't pick it up and move it again. So removing from the kitchen, I can take it just about anywhere. But if once I put it down, I can't pick it up again outside and move it elsewhere. So what's the ramification of this? Let's imagine I have an attached garage. So I take my garbage and I move it to the garage and put it in one of the bins that get put to the curb or get put to the end of the alley. Once I have it out of my kitchen, I'm no longer allowed to carry it, which means I cannot roll that bin outside to the curb or to the alley where the garbage will be picked up, because once it's no longer in my vicinity, there's no longer a Yom Tov purpose to me carrying it, and having the garbage man pick it up is not considered really to be a Yom Tov need. It's not in your way, it's not in your vicinity, it's not marring your experience. So what's the eitzah? What's the advice? How do you handle this? The advice that I advise people, and this really came up over Pesach, which was really important, was I told everyone, take their bins, move it as far out as you can, so without getting in the way if it's in the alley, or perhaps without getting in trouble with your neighbors if it's out in the front. You have to sort of negotiate this. Perhaps you would ask your non-Jewish neighbor to take it out if the front is going to be a problem. But if you have an alley, it was a little bit easier. And once the garbage is ready to go out, you're allowed to remove it from your kitchen, and you're allowed to carry it outside. That's a Yom Tov need. Once you put it down, you no longer have a Yom Tov need to move it, so you put it directly into the bin. So if you have the bin outside, you pick up the garbage from your kitchen and you carry it right to the dumpster, right to the bin where it's going to be collected, and you place it there. Again, you're only allowed to carry it to remove it from the kitchen. Once it's no longer in the kitchen, there's no longer a Yom Tov need to carry it. So you might as well put it in the dumpster or the bin, whatever we're going to call it, which if it's an alley, it's a bit easier. You've already moved out before Yom Tov, and you can put it down there. And that's how you handle taking out the garbage on Yom Tov. Carrying, we said, also has some of the same leniencies that we spoke about with, if you want to cook for the next day, you're allowed to add stuff. So it means, for example, if I'm bringing diapers with me, if my child is not yet potty trained, and I'm bringing it to somebody's home, and I know that they need diapers too, I'm allowed to carry, even if there's no Yom Tov need, even though I know they don't need it for Yom Tov, it's going to be for a different day. I know they're going to run out and they're not going to have it for the next day. I'm allowed to carry today if I have diapers in my bag that I'm anyways carrying with me, if I could just add to my bag. So much like the pot we said. So as long as it's all in the same bag, as long as I'm not doing any extra labor, it's all the same action. And I'm not saying explicitly that I'm carrying something outside for the next day, that I'm allowed to carry also in this manner. So again, I'm allowed to put all those extra diapers in my bag that I'm going to bring to my friend who needs it for the next day. I can put it all in my bag since I'm anyways carrying my own diapers. It's all there. I have my own day needs, and I'm carrying it all in the same bag, and I'm not doing any extra labor associated with it. And since I'm not saying explicitly what it's for, I'd be allowed to carry even if I'm carrying for the next day. This is where I'm going to stop. And I am now open to questions, comments, or rebuttals, and I will I'll stop the recording. And I see Herb has his hand up.